everybody, thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be taking a look at Fall Guy for Murder and Other Stories by Johnny Craig, which is in the Fantagraphics EC library. This is the first Fantagraphics EC library book that I've ever really spent time with. I'm aware of the series. I know a lot of the EC stuff. I've read scans or tried to read scans of a lot of EC stuff. Familiar with all the artists, know the legacy of it. But I've never really dived into the EC stuff, and when I have tried to read scans, I've found it very difficult to read. Largely, I'll talk about more, but largely just because of the overload of captions and things like that. Also, Johnny Craig is someone who I think I was pretty dismissive of until working on Strange Death, when I had to recreate one or two Johnny Craig pieces, and seeing the original art made a big difference. So I was a little hesitant going into this book because a lot of the versions of this that I've seen scans of or whatever, the old EC stuff, is pretty poorly reproduced. And I know Fantagraphics does a great job on reproduction, but they're oftentimes on these older projects working with poor resources, and there's nothing you can really do about that. It's like a lot of the IDW Rip Kirby strip reprints aren't that great, but they're the best you can get, really. So I was very worried about these EC books having that and some of the Breccia stuff that Fantagraphics has done is obviously from pretty poor negatives or something like that. So I was a little worried about these. I've been hesitant about getting them. In the Fantabuck sale, I figured I'd try a couple and see how they were, and have been really, really impressed with this one and just flipping through the other ones I got. Unfortunately, a lot of the ones I really wanted were out of stock, at least for Fantagraphics. Maybe I can get them online, but I did get a few with some artists I was really interested in, and this Johnny Craig one's the first one I've read through. So very impressed with the reproduction. I hope this holds on the rest of them. They look like they're working from pretty good resources. I don't see much fill in. Maybe a little bit of the details lost, but it's pretty clear. One thing that I was really interested in this volume, because I'm not super familiar with Craig's work other than the few pieces that I did, is he had his own really peculiar style in the work I was working on, which this kind of, with this extra addition of the hatching and stuff, seemed to be like his type of thing. It's interesting to see in the book how much of this kind of has a very Kniff feel to it, or some kind of mixture of these different artists that were very popular at the time. It's interesting over the course of this book that Johnny Craig kind of, you see him starting to synthesize all these things to head towards his own particular look. So I particularly like this, where he's doing this kind of looks like Leonard Starr trying to do his best Kniff. So it's kind of this weird in between, but there was a period where Leonard Starr was doing a Kniff knockoff, and we talk about that in Strange Death. And this really looks like that. It's a little bit closer to the realism than Kniff would get, but it has kind of the big juicy brushstrokes. So this looks like Starr doing Kniff to me, and then with a little bit of Craig twist. Whereas down here, this looks like more what I think of Johnny Craig, like having a little bit more hatching, a little bit more with the insidious lighting and things like that. And then looking at this, you see the influence going the other way, where I can see some Frank Miller brewing in here, some artists like that, some Neil Adams as well, with some of these kind of these hatching lines that aren't perpendicular to each other, but they're kind of at a 5 or 6 degree, 7 degree angle or something like that. There's some of that in there as well, and I think that goes through Adams to Frank Miller. So that's kind of cool to see. There's some really just great cartooning in here. Like here, you get this running character. There's a lot of the rubbery Will Eisner in there. This whole page feels very Eisner-y to me. So you see the Eisner and Kniff kind of lines coming together more clearly in here. And they're going through, I didn't want to overanalyze this book. You can see I put a bunch of notes, so I did. But I was trying to just find the images that really stood out to me for whatever reason. So a lot of these frontispiece images are just really, really strong. They're really beautiful compositions. A lot of the panel stuff, the compositions weren't so intense, but there's good stuff all the way through. Right here, I wish I could find it, but I think this is an Alex Raymond tracing of this character here. I think it's from the Songbirds one, but this looks very familiar to me. I know at the time it was pretty frequent practice to like swipe compositions and swipe poses and figures and rejigger them for whatever story you were doing. So that one just seems really familiar to me. It's interesting, the more and more and more I look at these old comic strips from this time period and the more familiar I get with it, and the familiarity I have obviously with Alex Raymond's work on Rip Kirby and whatnot, that kind of comic strip art stuff, the realist there, I start to recognize things, whether they be compositional tropes or pose tropes, costuming tropes, things like that. It's really interesting. I think there would be probably, we haven't thrown out a PhD thesis on the channel in a while, but I think if you took someone like Ryan Holmberg and does what he's doing with his deep research into the influences of manga artists and their swipe files and things like that, I think you could have some really interesting comics history done based on, like, how many times did this composition or this figure show up? Who was the originator of that? That could be a really interesting thing. I think it should be done as a comic, not as a piece of academia. I think Strange Death really set, Dave kind of set the standard for that. But it'd be interesting to someone just do the swipe file chain instead of the influence chain. That's like another peek at it. On this page, you get, again, with Johnny Craig. I think he's really best when he's doing like this kind of gnarly stuff. He doesn't do it much, even though these are supposed to be kind of horror comics. He's really much more grounded, which I appreciate him quite a bit as a writer. And I'm going to get into him as a writer later in the volume, because I did him dirty up until the last couple stories by not reading the captions. I also think this is a phenomenal drawing down here. But yeah, a lot of the barrier for me to the old EC stuff was it has the old comic format where there's too much going on in the captions. It kind of over explains things. And so for the majority of this volume, and usually when I read these type of old comics, I just skip the captions, and you can usually get whatever's going on anyways without them. But we'll talk about that more later in the book, because that actually was a bad idea in this book, and I'll have to go back and give it a second consideration whenever I have the time. Here on this page, I see a lot of stuff that kind of sets up, like, this seems kind of Dan Clowesy. Some of this stuff seems Charles Burnsy. So as I see Craig synthesizing, like, this isn't the greatest drawing. This is actually him heading towards what he's good at, but it's kind of clumpy and clumsy at this point. And I don't know continuity, if these are in the order they came out. They don't. I didn't see dates attached to these things. And in the table of contents, they don't have dates on here either. It would have been nice for historical purposes to have dates. So I'm assuming these are kind of in the order that they were done. And you see here, his skill with that approach isn't quite all together yet. But again, you can see where he's headed. You can see how he's synthesizing stuff, and you can see how his synthesis of all these greats has led to kind of a further influence going forward. Here, I think he gets it better. This is, again, just a really great drawing. All of his handling of clothing is especially beautiful to me. He very much uses the vocabulary of brushstrokes that was kind of in the air at the time, that seems to have been going around it. People were getting trained to make these marks as assistants or something, and he really leverages them well in a lot of his clothing. I made note of a lot of drawings just because I really liked what he was doing with the fabric for the most part. Here you have this story, that one of the times that I dipped into the story, I just thought this was an awful punishment. The scrap box was just what its name implies, a box where scraps of thread were thrown for reuse. The girls who worked the box had to sort the bits of thread, knot them together, and reel them onto spools according to the various hues. That's my nightmare, especially with all the colors and like having to untangle things. That just would drive me crazy. Here we get another frontispiece, and you kind of see his compositional skills. I notice on this one too that at least this seems to be inset with like a duo shade paper. That's kind of interesting. He uses that from time to time. I would guess that on the original art that is a cut in, that's done on a regular piece of board, and that's just like tipped in there. Really good drawing here. You get some, you see like some of the Jack Davis coming in and things like that. But I think these are really good drawings next to a not so great drawing here. So again, someone who I think is really pulling from everybody that is in the air at the time and putting them together to better results in some areas and worse. But you know, like who knows? This could have been studio productions as well. This woman here feels this actually a lot of this all feels very very Kniff to me, except the faces are a little bit more realistic. Also great composition here. It's too bad the lettering stopping that knee. Those shapes would have been really nice. Here we have like kind of an Eisner, but like toughened up is what it looks like, but that seems like the Eisner influence coming through to me. Whereas down here you kind of get an Eisner Kniff femme fatale lady. Really enjoy the lettering here. I can see the influence that this must have had on Dave Sim. I see a lot of that throughout. I also think this is a really good panel. This feels like something that could have been swiped from Raymond potentially, or just as a standard type of composition you would see at the time. But it solves an interesting problem that comic artists has, that if you have characters talking to each other and they should be facing each other, but these artists are really really good at putting people in a room where you can see all of their expressions and it feels like they're interacting, even though probably like this guy looking straight forward and this guy looking past him and this guy looking that way, no one really seems to be communicating to each other. But these artists are very good at making it plausible and getting good compositions out of it. That was one of the things I always hated as a younger artist, is writers would ask me to have two people talking, and you know, you're always with the back of someone's head, and I was never clever enough as these artists. So this is very helpful to see. This is just an awful ending here. With she convinces this guy that she's going to teach him to swallow swords, and then just leaves him there. It's pretty brutal. You definitely get, while you're reading this, also an idea of like why Frederick Wertham was, and why parents were going nuts. You know, these are some pretty intense stories, and then if you imagine young children reading them, you know, they're pretty, yeah, they're pretty violent. They're pretty vile in places, and you could see why parents were freaking out. So, I'm not a huge fan of what Wertham did to the American comics industry, but I also think, you know, it's a good lesson in self-regulation. Like, just because it's there's no one there regulating you, telling you not to do something, doesn't mean that it's the best idea in the world to go ahead and do it. And so, like, Gaines and those people maybe could have been a little bit more conscientious about, you know, the ramifications of what they were doing. Just really like this composition here, kind of the abstract nature of this. Like, if you break it into just this and this part, I think that's a really good one. That one seems more particular to me as well. Like, he came up with that himself probably, or at least I've not seen anywhere. Some more of the duo shade. This is interesting. This feels like it sets up Klaus a little bit. I don't know, something about that feels a little Klausy to me. I really like this one, where the story is about this woman and they're going to kill her by basically making a sculpture out of her. And he gives a really instructive little lesson here. So here, even though it's a story I still don't think I would necessarily give to kids, it's not as violent, it's not as bad, and it has some educational value. So I don't know, but I imagine when you're going to like the Senate committee as William Gaines, like this is the one you take with you to be like, no, we're you know, teaching kids lessons about chemistry and stuff, electroplating, how silver salt works. But, you know, but then you could kill someone with it. Also think this is a hell of a good drawing here. Part of the reason I think that this is in chronological order is I think the art gets better and better. And like I said, he gets more and more singular and idiosyncratic as he goes. Like right here, you really get something that feels entirely like Johnny Craig to me. I see all the influences, but it's come together again with that like strangely angled hatching that works so well for him, the uplighting that I associate with him, and then the thickness. Like that was one of the things I really kind of enjoyed when I was recreating his stuff for Strange Death, is his willingness to just do these big, like slobbery, chunky marks on there, and then his ability to move from that into the thinner mark making. And that's what I feel like he hadn't resolved as well early on. You also see a push towards a little bit more realistic stuff as he goes. You still see all of those influences there, but as he gets his own thing, they're becoming, more and more realistic, I think. One of the things I really started to appreciate as I was going through this book was the writing in the captions. I like I said, I typically avoid writing, and for some reason on this story, I think probably just because right here it starts with you, it's him doing something kind of I associate a little bit with Lovecraft, but like in reverse. But he's making it feel more real or like virtual body for me to occupy by saying you light another cigarette and impatiently flip the match. I think that's a really cool thing that he's up to. Another thing that I like about his writing is that it is all kind of horror stories, but they're more down to earth for the most part. There's monsters in some of them, but they're kind of like Stephen King, I think, in that they're poking at the what I call the American facade, especially at the time that these were being made. I would think that that was kind of like peak America, where we were really, really, truly the unquestionable superpower in the world, and just kind of the 40s and 50s like American household, and he's picking at that. He's picking it apart and showing the unsettling things underneath, and I find that interesting because it makes the horror more real. Like, I'm not particularly worried about vampires or zombies or things like that, but I think like Stephen King, he's oftentimes able to use these more standard horror tropes to talk about real life stuff. And I know most horror does that, but I feel like Johnny Craig is a little bit more grounded in that than I don't know. I haven't read a ton of this, but I feel like he's really well grounded in that, and I enjoy it. This is a strong composition. I see again, like with the way he's rendering the hand, this feels more particular to him. These big kind of chunky, wedgy, like Kirby fingers, but a little bit more realistic, kind of proto Eric Larson. Like he's getting his own thing. Again, with some of the way the thickness and the thinness goes together, this is starting to feel more, particularly Johnny Craig, especially on these big ones. The panel to panel stuff still is a little stock. Here's another cool one where he's using the duo shade paper to good effect, and this is reproduced really well. So I think Fantagraphics is doing a great job, and they've obviously got some really good assets to work with. I noticed this one in particular, his storytelling and the acting of the characters is really awesome. Also, a very subtle thing where he's very subtly shifting the camera. Like you can see more of the back of the chair here, and then you zoomed in a little bit and like tilted this way a little bit to focus more and more on this character, and you lose the chair and this character stands up. I think that's all really subtle and interesting. And then the acting on this character is really good as well, where he's like happy about what's going on and distressed about it, and then like working up some gumption, and now he's angry. Like he's realized his inheritance is going away, and so he's going to take some action. At first, he thinks he's going to be able to sell this house and get a lot of money, and then he realizes that he's not going to be able to. And I could see all that just in the art, which is awesome. So anyways, this estate that they're going to sell, I thought this was just historically interesting and worth pointing out. The entire castle is yours for $100,000 American money. So I can't imagine anyone selling a plot of land and a castle, no matter what state of disrepair, for $100,000 today. This drawing here is awesome. First off, great composition, great line work all the way throughout. I also noticed that in here, there's like a type of mark making that I hadn't seen yet in Craig's work, with the big black chunk down the middle, and then the tapered feathered hatch marks where the line weight gets thinner as it goes out to basically make the look of a shine. To me, this is Charles Burns. Like, you take that right there and then say, okay, apply that technique to everything. Everything's going to be rendered with big, thick, dark lines and like this technique, and you get Charles Burns. So that was a cool moment to see that like early thing. I think a lot of these faces here are getting more singular looking. Like, this is a very particular woman. This is like more of a standard when he's drawing her from the front, kind of kniff face. But when you have here, she's got this particular hook in her nose and stuff. She's not like the standard sexy comic woman. Her chin is a little, she has a slight underbite. It looks like she's got a hook in her nose. So it seems like he's drawn a very particular real person. Then you get that hatching style in the background, the big, thick, juicy marks. I really see him digging down into, again, that realism and his particular way of handling mark making here. And again, you can see the realism here. Again, you can see the influence on Clowes and Burns, and again, you can see that he's doing it better here than here. So either him or someone else was inking this or something, but this is a dramatically different approach from this in terms of the thinness, the way the thick and thin go together. On this page, I mean, oh my God, you can just see so many people throughout it. You can see like the Charles Burns in it. You can see like some Dan Clowes stuff in it. You can see, I think, in like this panel, and just some of like this right here as well. I think this has like some Gilbert Hernandez throughout it. I see some Steve Rude in some of these type of marks in the faces. Again, I think some of them work and some of them, like that one, doesn't really work. That kind of works, but I see a lot of Steve Rude, Charles Burns. I even see in like this character here and how this is represented some, and some of this as well, some Yoshihiro Suge. So Lord knows who was all looking at these and what the influences were. This kind of seems Suge-ish to me as well. But I think it's just like really, really cool to see that chain of influences. And again, I would totally buy historical works that would go into that. This is something where I just had to say, like the drawing on this is phenomenal. Like this whole contour of this edge here that's just made with the shapes around it. There's no line on it. The immediacy, the calligraphic nature of the marks, the hands, like everything about that is just a great panel. Great drawing of fabric, great drawing of hands, awesome work. Here's another one. I just couldn't help myself. I just think it's a really great panel. Love the hand. Love all the abstraction and the brush marks. Love his face, the relaxation of the pose. The only part that's a little weird is the legs down here. Just great art. And here's some more really great stuff. Again, this is very Johnny Craig, having all of the darkness here with the hatching outs. That seems very particular to him. I think that's really, really good drawing there. This is also another one of these stories that's just like a particularly wicked story. It's a week passed before Evan came home. He had entered happily and he turned his back to hang up his hat. Amy and Susan stared at horror in the back of the head at the small white patch of hair. So what had happened was he had tricked two, and this is again where you could see why parents would be like, oh man, I don't want my kids reading this. This character has basically fallen in love with twins and is pretending to be a twin himself so he can sleep with both of them. And he's come up with this completely unbelievable story that him and his brother like share a ranch in Australia or something like that, and they have to fly back and forth. And here you see that the women have shaved a patch in the back of his head, and that's how he doesn't know, and that's how they realize that it's the same guy. And then they're pissed because they realize that he's turned them, he's basically shamed them. He made us bigamists. So that's just a lot to be introducing to kids. I think I could see why parents are freaking out about that. I think in terms of stories, like this one with the twin sisters, and then the one after it, these are the type of things I really like Johnny Craig's writing, because they are horrific, but they are more in the psychological thriller horror vein. So like in this one, this main character has broken in and committed a crime, and then he's obviously someone who struggles with heavy OCD, and so he's running around the house thinking about every possible way he could have left evidence, and just drives himself nuts. And I think the representation of that, like as reality just starts breaking down and all of the what ifs start imposing themselves on him, all of the ideas of fingerprints start imposing himself on him, And then these panel structures here are just really, really interesting compositions. And again, I think, this is stuff where you're looking at him going, yeah, you didn't swipe that. Like you're inventing something. Someone else might have done something similar, but you're really playing there, and I like that. Here you see, I believe, a portrait of Johnny Craig himself, who was apparently a very handsome man, chained to his desk. And in this one, I said, okay, I'm going to, because I've now read a couple of them, where I like on this one, I read some of the captions because there was so much going on with captions without any lettering. I started reading some of the captions. I didn't need the captions to understand the story, but I realized they were fleshing things out in an interesting way. So in this one, I decided that I was going to go ahead and read the captions, which I don't normally do, and see how they flesh it out. And again, I could see going into the story that's very caption heavy, and I was like, I don't know. But I wanted to see it, and actually, I was really impressed with Johnny Craig's writing, and that he's not like most writers of this time period that I'm familiar with, which is it's like, well, Batman punched the Joker and it hurt, and then you see like Batman punching the Joker and Joker's going, ow, that hurts, and the captions are completely irrelevant. In here, it really read, and this is a way I hadn't really thought about comics. I mean, I know what it is, I've just never liked it, and I've never seen one that I thought was really effective, but like the Prince Valiant model, where a comic is basically a collection of illustrated prose. And in this one, I think that's what Craig is doing. He's illustrating the prose and adding to it, but they kind of cross-speak to each other. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, it allowed me to imagine more into the picture by reading the prose. And vice versa. So it gave a more, like, this is what the artist wants me to think. They don't want any vagueness about what's going on. And then they'll paint into that a little bit with the caption. So, the woman tumbled from the accordioned machine, platinum hair now tinted red. So there, I don't need the accordion machine necessarily. That's just there because you need to make the sentence work. But we're talking about her platinum hair now tinted red in a black and white thing. That's very important. Flesh once powder white, now wine colored. I wouldn't know that about the character. Delicate jeweled fingers clutching her face changed colors with the streaming blood that stained her hairs, dripped to the ground, infused, dissolving with the frolicking gutter water. She teetered drunkenly and fell. So she doesn't fall. We don't see her fall. There's all of this kind of addition to, this is a frozen moment in time that relates to this, and this tells, maybe like 45 seconds worth. And so I started to notice that, like, man, this guy actually is doing something really interesting in the combination of like literature where the prose is very important, and comics, and in a way that I haven't really thought about in a long time, because like I said, I tend to just avoid that. I don't want to do a lot of reading in a comic, and this opened my mind up to, oh wow, okay, that's really powerful, and that's a way for me to think about comics that I've been purposely kind of shunting to the side for a long time. In this panel here, you take that, and I see some early Jaime Hernandez for sure in that. And again, that's because his faces, especially the straight on is kind of stock for him, but on the profiles, his characters get much more particular. And then over here, I actually really like this page because I imagine the Hernandez brothers sitting here, and something about this feels like early Gilbert, like with the bigger lines and the weird hatching and stuff feels more like Gilbert Hernandez, and that feels very much like Jaime. So I don't know. I don't know if they've ever talked about it, but does anyone know? Have they ever talked about I'm sure they were reading EC, but did they talk about Johnny Craig, particularly this story? I just imagine them sitting there, and like Jaime's looking at this page and Gilbert's looking at this page. It's just cool to see both of them on one page, basically.